Ni hao, and welcome back to another in our ongoing series of screencast lectures on ancient history, this one on a region that calls itself the Middle Kingdom, probably better known to most of you as China. We will specifically going back a little farther into the Bronze Age, but then spending the bulk of the time on the Axial Age, also known in Chinese history as the Warring States period or the Age of 100 Schools. There were several earlier kingdoms or dynasties in China that were long thought to be legendary. We now know from recent archaeological evidence that they did in fact exist, but we still do not know much about them. Some of the beliefs still influence Chinese culture today. For example, the belief in the importance of one's ancestors. Praying to ancestors for help and guidance in the common day can be traced back to this earlier Bronze Age period. However, because we know comparatively little about this early period of Chinese history, we will begin in what we have termed the Axial Age, with the Zhou Dynasty or the Zhou Kingdom in ancient China. It emerges in the western region of China here, and then spreads out and helps to conquer the eastern kingdoms and tribes as well. This is a recurring theme in Chinese history: hardy, warlike people emerging out of the West and coming to conquer and unify the East. This is the beginning of a pattern as well. Drought or other environmental issues leads to the collapse of the earlier Bronze Age Shang kingdom and the emergence of the Zhou, which you can again see here overlaid on a more contemporary map of modern China, as well as Mongolia to the north. We see the continued emphasis under the Zhou of the earlier traditions I alluded to, ancestor worship, the importance of an orderly succession from one rule to the next, and the idea of hereditary rule, that a son is going to usually rule after his father, or at least some younger male relative, perhaps a nephew or a cousin as well. We also see the expansion through local leaders. These are not, at this period, strongly unified governments. Each local leader pays tribute or honor to the larger king or emperor. Also, under the Zhou is the promotion of ethnic unity, trying to unify China, and it is at this point that they begin to call all of the people Chinese as opposed to the earlier local tribal names that they had. They also begin to refer to their kingdom as the Middle Kingdom, believing it to be in the middle or the center of the earth. We also see, and this is why we know more about them, the emergence of scribes, and for the first time, written records of a Chinese government. We see as well the steady increases and progresses. Here is some beautiful bronze work, as well as the growth of irrigation networks. By the end of the rule of the Zhou, there are about 20 million people in China, and it is from this point forward that China becomes, and still remains to this day, the most populous area of the world. So it is in this ancient Zhou period that they begin to have the most population, and that has continued throughout the rest of world history. One of the key concepts that emerges under the Zhou is this idea of the mandate of heaven. It is how the Zhou justify their rule and their claiming of power from the earlier kingdoms and rulers. The mandate of heaven is the belief that the ruler is chosen and rules with the authority of heaven, or the gods, or some higher power, right? It is tied to this idea of the dynastic cycle as well, where an old dynasty begins to become corrupt. It taxes people too much, it stops protecting them, there are wars, there are invasions, things begin to fall apart. At which point, according to this model, the old dynasty loses the mandate of heaven. Things are going badly, and therefore clearly the gods do not favor them. So therefore, other problems emerge as a judgment of the heavens, floods and earthquakes or droughts, as we saw, a revolt by the peasant, invasions by outsiders, troubles all around. Therefore, a new group comes in and claims the mandate, says, they have lost the mandate, we are now the chosen rulers. And of course, they bring peace and stability and land and protection. As time goes by, the new dynasty gets fat and corrupted old, and the pattern continues to repeat. The slow and long decline of the Zhou is generally divided into two periods, the spring and autumn period from 722 to 481, and the period of the Warring States from 403 to 221 BCE. Now, it is not that the Zhou completely collapse. Here you can see them still as they are here as well, but they begin to lose their authority. Pieces of the empire start to peel away, go independent. There are invasions. There are, again, the sort of traditional problems associated with the previous slide. Invasions from the north and west, specifically around the Qin people, who we will talk more about later, as well as the presence of cheaper and better iron weapons, as more and more people can make and use these cheap and strong iron weapons, not just bronze. This undermines the authority of the Zhou. However, in spite of this chaotic, tumultuous, about 500-year period, new ideas often emerge out of the turmoil, and those ideas are going to be what we are going to focus on. One of the most important scholars and thinkers from China in this period is known in Chinese as Confucius, or by his more Latinized, Europeanized name, Confucius. He lived, we believe, from about 551 to 479 BCE. He believed, and here is a quote of his teachings, that people should be guided by edicts or laws and keep them in line with punishments. However, if you try this, people may stay out of trouble but will have no sense of shame. In other words, laws and punishments alone do not work. Instead, guide them by virtue, keep them in line with the rites or rituals, and they will, besides having a sense of shame, reform themselves. This is the fundamental root of his teachings or ideas. He looks back to earlier, better days of the Zhou, before the Warring States period, and he seeks an enlightened ruler to teach and to put his ideas into practice, which never actually happens during his lifetime. He fundamentally believes that people are good, and that if you guide them correctly, people will do good. He emphasizes natural harmony, and harmony is achieved through family and patriarchal authority as a model for the ruler. One of the key ideas from Confucius is the idea of filial piety, that a son should honor and respect his father, just as a people honor and respect their ruler. This idea of having a great respect and honor for one's elders is true as well for teachers and education. However, a twist on this that is different from the earlier ideas is that anyone can be educated and trained, and in fact should. It's a new idea of who can and should rule that can be seen in this Chinese term that is sort of coined and promoted by Confucian teachings, and that is Junzi. It's the idea of a gentleman. Prior to Confucius, you had to be born a gentleman, right? You were a gentleman or a noble because of who your father was. According to the teachings of Confucius, it is still hierarchical. People are better than you and deserve your respect, but anyone can attain this ideal of being a noble gentleman through education. It is not solely based on one's status at birth. While Confucianism is still influential and is a crucial idea going forward in Chinese history, it is not the only idea that emerges in this period. We can also talk about Taoism, or the Way. It is attributed to an old teacher called Lao Tzu, or Old Master. He may have lived about the same time as Confucius, or he may in fact be legendary. We don't know much about him, including if he actually existed. However, his sort of teachings, his words of wisdom have come down to us. He believed that you should follow the natural order and the cosmos, that things are going to naturally attain balance, and that you should flow with them like water. His fundamental idea is wu wei, or doing nothing, to be spontaneous, to not interfere, and to accept things as they are. He scorned the Confucian ideals of ritual and rites and hierarchy, and he believed that the ruler who did the least was the best. His ideals are encapsulated in the yin and yang, right? Black and white, order and chaos, in balance and harmony together. Here are two quotes from the two schools of thought to give you some idea of their differences. From Confucian teachings, Zigong asked about government, and the master, Confucius, said, "The goal of government is sufficient food, sufficient military force, and the confidence of the people." And his teacher said, "If one had to get rid of one of them, what would you get rid of?" And the master said, "Get rid of the military." He says, "Well, if you had to get rid of another one, which would you get rid of next?" And he said, "Food, because since ancient times there's always been death, but without confidence a people cannot stand. So confidence of the people, the good example, is more important than food or the army itself." Opposed to the teachings of Taoism, "If one desires to take the empire and act upon it, I say that he will not succeed. The empire is a sacred vessel that cannot be acted upon. In being acted upon, it is harmed, and in being grasped, it is lost. Thus, the sage, or wise man, rejects the excessive, the extravagant, the extreme." In other words, if you try to act on the empire, if you try to do anything, it is just going to cause more problems. Another school of thought is Mohism. Again, a sort of in the aftermath of the teachings of Confucius from 470 to 391 BCE. Otzi emerges, and he, unlike Confucian and some of the other scholars, is a commoner, not from any noble or higher class background. And he broke with the teachings of Confucius because he found them impractical, that they were just not going to work. And his teachings and his followers are much better at organizing and implementing their ideas than Confucians were. They taught the ideal state was of greater cooperation and universal love, and to achieve this peace and cooperation, they became experts at warfare, which is a sort of historical irony. Their teachings and ideas are sort of eventually consumed or taken over by the last school of thought, and that is legalism. Very simply, they believed that people are innately bad and could not be trusted. They were the opposite of the sort of ideal state of goodness and harmony embodied by Confucianism. They believed people needed a strong moral education and control to keep them in line through strict laws and very harsh punishments because people were naturally inclined to bad and evil actions. Thank you very much for this brief overview of the axial age in China. Goodbye.